Welcome to the second season of Adapt, Climate Change and the Built Environment, where we interview professionals across the private and public sectors to discuss adapting the built environment to a changing climate. We believe that ensuring climate adaptation to extreme weather and evolving climate patterns needs us to re-examine what it takes to make our buildings, infrastructure, and communities resilient and adaptable, so that our society can continue to thrive for years and decades to come. And with that, let's get started.
Hi, Mónika.
Hi, Jessica.
I am so excited to be talking to you today and our upcoming guest, because today we are talking to Amy Macdonald, founder and principal at Ripple Resilience.
I'm so excited to talk to her and learn what the role of a resilience consultant is.
Very. And I mean, she has an impressive background. She's got this international focus where she's worked on 4 continents, and she even has a connection to one of our season 1 guests. She is currently the co-leader of the Transportation Working Group, who is working on NYSERDA's climate assessment for New York. And of course, for our loyal listeners, they will know that we talked to Suzanne DeRoche of NYSERDA in season 1.
Amy has a background in civil engineering. She led Resilience at Thornton, Tomasetti, and is currently principal and founder of Ripple Resilience, a resilience consulting firm.
So tell me, Mónika, was there anything in particular that really stood out to you from this interview?
What really stood out from this interview is what a resilience consultant does. When I started this position, and I literally had to Google what is resilience and figure out what it meant for our firm and the built environment. If somebody had asked me, where can I go to incorporate resilience in my building or my community, I wouldn't have known where to go. And now we know that we can go to Amy or folks like Amy and firms like Ripple Resilience and engage them as early as possible.
Yeah, engage them early and often, right? I think that would be a key takeaway from this episode.
Absolutely.
I will say, in addition to that, the second takeaway for me was this whole reframing that she offered. She has a real background in dealing with earthquakes and earthquake recovery. Earthquakes, with some minor small exceptions, really aren't a climate change issue, but they're certainly a disaster that's been happening, well, for as long as we've had plate tectonics. And there's a lot of lessons that can be learned there. And I think one thing she talked about is taking the functional recovery approach from earthquake recovery and applying that to recovery from other disasters. So not just thinking about how can we make sure we protect people's lives in extreme weather events or in disasters, natural disasters, but also how can we make sure that the built environment either is able to continue to function even during the disaster, or if not able to function during the disaster, if it can bounce back quickly afterwards. And I think kind of that reframing and thinking about that functional recovery is a key takeaway from this interview as well.
Absolutely. In fact, Alice Hill, our first guest of this season, alluded to an example of a building in Japan, right, where champagne flutes stood even though an earthquake took place. So I hope that that's the kind of recovery we get to with all types of different severe weather events.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. We can learn a lot from earthquakes. So with that, Mónika, as always, I'm excited to talk to you, and I'm really excited to talk to our next guest. Hi, welcome to Adapt, Climate Change in the Built Environment. I'm Jessica Mederson. I'm here as always with my co-host, Mónika Serrano. Hi, Mónika.
Hi, Jessica.
And we have with us today a very special guest. We are talking to Amy Macdonald. She has worn and continues to wear many hats, but she right now is actually the founder and principal at Ripple Resilience. So we are going to talk to her about our favorite topic, resiliency in the face of climate change in the built environment. So Amy, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So let's start. I just referenced a little bit all the different things you've done. Can you tell us a little bit about your background and how you got into this resiliency space?
Yeah, sure. So my educational background is in engineering, geology, and environmental science. But as soon as I started my career, I was very quickly taken into the world of natural hazards and the intersection with the built environment. So buildings, infrastructure, mainly roads, airports, utilities type things. And it was through this experience and seeing what goes wrong when we don't prepare for the impact of natural hazards in the built environment that I got very deeply passionate about resilience and climate adaptation being, I suppose, more of an iteration over the last 10 to 15 years. It began with landslides impacting houses and roads in New Zealand was how it all began. And then really moved into more dealing with earthquakes, floods, hurricanes, and then seeing the impact of climate change, the impact climate change is having on those different natural hazards. And through that experience of really working on the very reactive side of disasters, I became very passionate and knew that my direction needed to be more on that proactive side. So taking a more proactive approach to understanding the risks before they become a disaster, and then also trying to reduce the impacts that they have on people's lives, their buildings, infrastructure, and our communities in general.
Yes, you get sick and tired of seeing the disaster and the damage and the harm that's done. So you're like, why do we have to keep going through this same disaster cycle? What can we do? Landslides, and I think this will come up again later as we talk, but obviously the landslide issue continues to be a major issue, especially on the West Coast, and seems like I don't know, all the natural disasters are horrific, but that one it seems really terrifying in some ways. That's great that you're trying to get more proactive. That's part of what we're trying to do too, although we obviously, I don't think have seen the disasters you have.
Yeah, that's a good thing.
Yeah.
But it has driven very much my professional desires, and I suppose the direction that my career has gone as well.
Can you tell us a little bit about what you're working on now?
So the projects I've been working on recently have spanned from the East Coast of the US across to the West Coast and all the way to New Zealand. So I'm originally from New Zealand. The projects I've been working on, a lot of them are coastal projects. That seems to be at the moment where people are really understanding the importance of designing, considering the impacts of climate change. But yeah, working on master plans for new developments, master plans for existing buildings or infrastructure. Yeah, across New York and Boston. I have several new building projects in Florida that I've been working on. In addition to still doing a lot of work, I have a background with a lot of earthquake experience as well, both response and resilience design work as well. And so I'm working with the insurance industry actually to help prepare the industry as a whole for a major catastrophe. We really haven't had a very significant one in the US since Northridge, which was now 30 years ago.
Well, and so talking about preparing for these sort of tragedies and going back to what you were really first working on, I think we talk a lot about psychology on this, right? Even though this is about science and engineering and all of that, we talk about how human psychology and the way we're wired just makes us struggle with dealing with something like climate change. And I think when we talk about disasters, we're used to, especially now that I'm in flyover country, you hear about a wildfire in California or an earthquake somewhere or tornadoes. And you're like, that's sad, but that's just kind of life. And then you just go back, then we rebuild and we'll deal with it next time. I think what most people probably don't see unless they've lived through it. What have you seen as far as if we fail to prepare for disasters? Do any of us understand just how really bad it is?
Yeah, I think the communities that have been hit with major disasters, they do understand. And the challenging thing in terms of human psychology is that we have short memories, right? So we have these events, even like in New York, for example, Sandy created a very big shock to the system. And while the city is still considering climate change as being very progressive, actually, in the climate adaptation and resilience space, in terms of incorporating resilience guidelines and requirements into their own city projects, we're already finding that developers, some are very proactive and some are already really trying to do the bare minimum, which becomes a real challenge when you're trying to be proactive and take into account future conditions, particularly if the city or state requirements don't incorporate climate change projections. So I think that's one of the things I'd really like to see change in the future, as more cities and states being proactive in terms of incorporating climate change projections into their natural hazard design requirements and also urban planning requirements. There are certainly many wonderful examples where that is happening now already across the country, actually, as well, which is great. But the FEMA flood maps use very backwards looking data. So a lot of the flood maps that are what people are using to design based on the building code don't incorporate climate change projections. And so having that as a requirement as opposed to a optional nice to have is really the direction that we need to be moving in order to be designing and building buildings and infrastructure that are actually going to be there for the future generations.
You mentioned earthquakes as one of your experience as an expertise. California is very earthquake focused. Are there any climate related concerns or lessons that can be applied to climate change resilience?
Yes, definitely. So California certainly is very earthquake focused, and with good reason. The seismic risk, not just in California, also in Oregon and in parts of the Carolinas and Washington, also very significant seismic risk. But in terms of other climate related concerns, wildfire has been a massive challenge every summer or every wildfire season that, which has been growing in intensity and duration. We also see after these wildfires have taken place, when you then have a heavy rainfall come through and you now no longer have that protection for the soil and the ground that has been taken away by the wildfire, you then have the challenge that you have a higher susceptibility to landslides, which we've seen again and again in California, Italy specifically. But these extreme rainfall events, such as we sometimes call them cloudburst events or arc storms, are also impacting California, which is a little ironic, I think, given that people often correlate drought and wildfire with the lack of rain. Then we're having these extreme events, rainfall events, that this building and the city systems just are not designed to be able to deal with, and then that results in flooding. So yes, in addition to earthquake preparedness, California too needs to be considering climate risks, and certainly certain parts of them are, and we can incorporate more rigorous building codes and community education to adapt and address these climate risks. I think one of the things that we can learn from earthquake resilience, from the earthquake resilience space, though, is about functional recovery and performance-based design and how we can incorporate that into the way we deal with climate risks as well. So I certainly see that as an area that was where we can take lessons from one type of natural hazard and the advances that have been made in that space and can be brought through into the climate adaptation and resilience space too.
That performance-based design, that actually just came up in our last interview as well. And I think that's something that I have to start thinking about more. Mónika and I talk a lot about building codes, but really building codes, their main focus has always been on saving lives, right? So that way people can get out of the building safely. But yeah, what came up in our last interview was that we need to start doing this. And I think this is what you mean, but I just want to be sure I understand with the earthquakes. It's not just making sure people survive the earthquake, for example, but that we can get back into that building or we can start reusing that infrastructure quickly, right? So it's not just about saving lives, but also being sure that a building, a network, a system, whatever, can bounce back and continue operating or get back online or stable again soon, right? Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, absolutely. So if we're thinking about flood, so if we're thinking about storm surge, flooding events that are getting exacerbated by sea level rise, what we're looking at is not just trying to keep obviously people have to be out of these buildings. Usually there are evacuation orders in most of these areas anyway. But it's not just about the building meeting life safety, which is the bare minimum, what building code requirements requires, but it's also about certain types of building, you might actually want them to be able to maintain operations during the storm surge flood event, right? And so if the power is down because the city systems are down, and there's no water available, then how would we need to be able to think about functional operational sides of the building operations as opposed to just the building structure itself. So how do we provide redundancy in terms of having generators or things like that allow continued power during, or continued functional operations during the event. Whereas, so like for a hospital example, you might want to continued operations right through, whereas an office building, you might just want to maintain the bare minimum functions of the building so that as soon as the event is over, that you can re-enter and reoccupy the building, which is the kind of that approach, thinking about what sort of performance do we want from this building during these different levels of events, and then designing for that, thinking beyond just the structure and thinking also about the internal functions and contents and everything of the building.
Ooh, I love that. All right, that's good. We have to start talking about that more. That's great.
Yeah, well, I think with earthquakes, like a lot of the damage is structural damage, and that's where that major life safety of the building collapses. You've very obviously major issues, but there also are a lot of examples from different earthquakes around the world where the structure was actually okay, but all of the interior functions of the building, so in terms of the non-structural elements, plumbing, mechanical systems, if all of that is down after the event, even though the building is still standing, no one can go back into the building and use it because there's major work required to get it back to a functional point. And so that's one of the other things I think that we can be, or another way of thinking about climate resilience and adaptation for buildings, is thinking about, okay, what are the non-structural elements that we need to be designing or at least planning and preparing for in order to be able to get back in that building as quickly as possible.
Yeah, that makes sense. Another note on California, you mentioned climate risk. California did pass a law recently on climate risk disclosure. So I believe in 2025, companies, there's a certain threshold, will have to disclose climate risk, both physical and transition. So I wonder if that will advance the physical climate risk mitigation on buildings. We'll have to see.
Yeah, I think this is a really important first step, right? To have that disclosure. And then you really want to see it next driving action.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
driving physical risk reduction actions.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
when we start to see those two paired together, we're heading in the right direction.
That's right. That's right. You also mentioned you work both with existing buildings and new
Yeah.
buildings. So what's the biggest difference between a new building and an existing building when you're working on climate resilience?
Yeah, I think with a new building, you're really starting with a blank slate. You're starting from scratch, right? And you can design, you get to choose right from the beginning. If you take a climate resilience and adaptation lens, or resilience really lens with a new building, you can begin with building placement, where you even put that building, right? And then what the design criteria is, and then even what elevation the floors are at. So all of these things you get to start from the beginning to incorporate climate resilience very early on in that process. Whereas with an existing building, you've already got a lot of criteria that you need to work around, because the design criteria was initially built to, right? Like that's your starting point, and then there's some sort of retrofit that's the next step. But you've already got existing floor elevations and building placement. And as a result, you also are often trying to work around preservation of certain elements versus the retrofit or the renovation that you're trying to do. So it's a lot easier to incorporate climate resilience into a new building if it's part of the initial discussion right at the very beginning of the project. But we have a lot of existing building stock, and so designing retrofits is, in my opinion, equally important. But you're looking at it through a different lens, with a more of a cost benefit kind of lens too. Like, if we're going to make these changes, what are we potentially saving down the track, right?
That is hard. And we talk a lot about the different financial incentives, the different, all the different kind of pressures or benefits or incentives for developers, for owners when they're looking at this sort of thing. I feel like I hear more talk about just generally resiliency, even without climate change, but certainly in the face of climate change, more on the infrastructure side. We hear a lot about our aging infrastructure. We certainly hear about bridges after there's a bridge collapse or something like that. Are there differences that you see in addressing resiliency for infrastructure versus, let's say, an office building or an apartment unit?
Yeah, I think there are very different scales that you're dealing with, and in terms of the interconnectedness of the different pieces. So building projects are more localized and they're focused, as you say, on individual structures. So you've got coordination across the different systems within the building, but you've got a whole lot of things external that you can't really change. And so they're set criteria that you're working around. So if the grid goes out, your building isn't going to change whether or not the grid goes out, right? But it can change whether or not it's prepared to continue with redundancy and backup generators and things like that. So building projects are a lot more contained, I suppose, in many ways, whereas infrastructure, you're typically dealing with a much larger scale, and there's a lot more interconnected pieces that need to be considered, whether it's transportation networks or utilities or water management. It requires more of a regional focus and a lot of long-term planning, which we are starting to see. A lot of our big infrastructure agencies are taking that approach now and incorporating. They have their own climate resilience guidelines for their projects, which is really, really great to see, actually.
It's got to be interesting too, just from an owner incentive standpoint,
Yeah.
right? When it comes to building stock, historically, generally owned by private business, unless it's owned by our federal government or a state or local government. But obviously, infrastructure, I know there are like private sewer systems and things like that, but I think for the most part, our infrastructure is owned by various government entities. So
Yeah.
they at least don't have the profit margin consideration. Obviously, they still can have a lot of budgetary constraints, but they are supposed to be thinking about the health and well-being
Long-term.
of their communities, and yeah, hopefully a more long-term view. So I know obviously trying to deal with different political agencies when you talk about doing things across regions, I'm sure that can have its own set of challenges. But yeah, hopefully there's a little bit more positive incentives to try to ensure that these structures work. Infrastructure, especially our sewer system, is like the unsung hero of modern day life. We may have a lot of problems, but I'm like, thank God we have like good sewer systems. So, nobody wants to think about that, but I'm like, this is why I would never want to travel back in time. Thank you very much. And if we need to pay more in taxes to make sure our sewer systems work, I will gladly pay that.
Even with transportation systems, right? There's with our subway systems or rail system, other overland rail systems, there is an opportunity, I think, though, that those agencies have, which is to do things piecemeal. So as they're planning an upgrade for one station, let's say, or one part of their network, they can then incorporate those climate resilience and adaptation guidelines into the different projects that they have. So they could definitely have the opportunity to take a much more longer term approach. Whereas with an individual building, it's more of a, okay, this is the one project. Whereas I think with the infrastructure, there's so many different nodes to the system or the network that it needs to be done in a more piecemeal, even though you still need that bigger picture view and vision on what you're doing and why you're doing it. So both have their challenges, but very necessary.
Yes, all of them are necessary. I heard recently that some train, I don't know if it was Amtrak, I forget exactly what the train system was, but they're starting to create some heat mitigation at the stations. Like there's certain
Yeah.
equipment that now is shaded, right? Or certain stops that are shaded to deal with the heat. But I have even heard of rail systems that slow down in the
Yeah.
face of heat, which it's worrisome, but also fascinating that there's all these like compounding effects, right, from different climate hazards. When you examine climate risk as a resilience consultant, how do you examine those climate risks? Are there certain like steps that you follow?
Yeah, sure. We're typically starting with the climate data. So both historical, what's happened in the past, what are the current hazard levels, and then also what are the future projections. And then when we've identified what each of those are, and I suppose there's usually quite a wide range, right? And then also where current codes and standards fit within those hazard levels, look at what are the vulnerabilities based on the exposure. So the location and then the types of buildings or infrastructure, different elements that you have. and how they can be impacted at those different levels. And then when you have identified what the potential damage or disruption or impacts would be at each of those different levels, then you're speaking with your client about what is acceptable. Like at this level event, what sort of damage or impacts, disruption are you expecting? And is what we're anticipating is going to happen based on this assessment, is that acceptable? Because if it's not, that's when you're identifying the difference between that gap between the desired performance of different portions of a building structure, or the performance of the way it will be operating at these different level of events, and what the expected impacts will be. And that's how we then identify where do we need to make some changes to increase the resilience of the building and the infrastructure, different elements of the infrastructure, and how can we incorporate those into the design, or not always just the design, often it's into the emergency management processes or operational processes of the building. And so from that, then those strategies there's usually several options on how you can achieve that change or the improvement, risk reduction, various ways of discussing that, and then incorporating that into the design. These can be very simple, and ideally things are simple and involve very much a passive measures, resilience measures, but sometimes there'll also be some sort of human intervention. And so then when you do have an intervention required, such as putting up a flood barrier that is not there permanently, you then need to have plans on how that's actually going to happen. And so that involves training and identifying locations for storage and how much storage you're going to need, making sure that they're tested and put into place each year, just to make sure you have lots of staff turnover, making sure that everyone is up to speed on what the plan is, so that when there is a forecast hurricane en route, that's not when you're starting to train people and learn, oh, we're missing this piece and it's on back order or something, Like we really need to make sure that everything is as smooth as possible when the event actually happens, and everyone's aware of what the plans are to do that.
We talked before about seeing some changes kind of driven by the earthquake, damage, of focusing more on like performance-based guidelines for buildings, things like that. Are you seeing, having spent years in kind of disaster recovery and working on the built environment, are you seeing more government regulations or like zoning changes, or more discussions about those sort of kind of government imposed mandates that may help with both preventing and responding to disasters or other climate change related events?
Yeah, we are. We are certainly seeing that some local municipalities have incorporated climate adaptation and resilience guidelines into basically requirements for projects that meet a certain size or value. The other way that we're starting to see it is with places where it's being incorporated into any zoning change requests. So if your area if the site is zoned for having single families and you now want to put multifamily on it, and you have to go to the city to change that zoning, then they're requiring that you incorporate these new climate adaptation and resilience guidelines into the design of these, whatever the project is that you're trying to get approval for. So I think those are a couple of really good ways of doing that. We're certainly not seeing it everywhere. So I think that the government regulations do help. They actually make it a lot easier having those conversations with clients. This is the requirement. This is what we're going to do. And in places where it's just an optional extra, you could do this if you want to. With certain clients, it can be a real challenge when they're trying to minimize cost. And the earlier that you have this conversation, and the earlier that you try and incorporate resilience into the design of a building, the less it costs. And I think that's another aspect that is often missed, actually, is if you bring in someone to look at resilience when you're in CDs and construction documents, as opposed to during concept design, the cost and implication on the project is significantly different. And it really does feel like, if you're already at that CD stage, it really does feel more like you're retrofitting an existing building, even though it's never been built. So I would urge people to consider having that conversation early in the life cycle of any project to ensure that it is part of that. One, you minimize the cost of actually enhancing the resilience of the project, but two, it also just makes it part of the base value of the project too, which has a lot of long-term value, both to the property owner, but also to anyone who's living, using, or working in that space in the future.
Yeah, definitely point taken. That the earlier you get involved, the better. And I
Yeah.
want to talk more about that point, but before that, talking about the zoning changes that you
Yeah.
were mentioning, I want to give some shout outs to the locations that are actually doing it. Can you share some of the locations that are either changing their zoning, or when you are going to go get the permit, they're saying, okay, you can get the permit if you do X, right? That being an adaptation measure.
Yeah. Yeah, New York City and Boston both have been very much on the forefront with this space. We're starting to see more and more from local municipalities in Florida as well. And they've obviously been dealing with flooding for a very, very, very long time. And the sunny day flooding, which is these high tide floods that we're starting to see, continue to see, and are continuing to get worse, have been driving some of that change too. And so I think that these municipalities that we are seeing that are really pushing for this are very still, I think, on the more progressive side, but that is the direction and the modeling that we need to see from our local authorities.
Yeah, that's great. There's usually a premium associated, or at least that's what folks think, that there is a premium associated with incorporating resilience or adaptation on day one, right? So you already mentioned we have to think of climate adaptation as early as possible, right? And not wait until the design is complete. How do you deal with asking building owners or developers what motivates them to spend the money to address resilience and adaptation?
Typically, we find it's the owners who have long-term interests in the properties that are the most motivated. So they can see that there's long-term benefits of investing in resilience in terms of reduced risk of damage. Sometimes there's lower insurance costs or the ability to get insurance. These two have been closely linked. And then I think we will be starting to see in the future the enhanced property value. When the property next door has no resilience measures and has significant damage from an event, and the one your property had resilience incorporated into it and still was standing and functional after the event, that's when we start to see that enhanced property value coming into play too. But ultimately, it's about reducing the risk of property damage and the risk of disruption, and allowing the tenants or whoever's inhabiting the building, whether that's someone living in the building or just using it or working there, it's allowing them to continue doing what they do there in the long term.
Is it part of your services to quantify how much that premium will be, if there's any, or what the cost after a disaster is?
Yeah, and sometimes we do a cost benefit analysis. And so FEMA actually requires that on many of their projects, is to incorporate that, the BCA, benefit cost assessment. But there are different options in terms of how you incorporate those resilience measures. And so, yes, it would help identify what those costs would be for those different measures, and then also what is a rough order of magnitude in terms of what you're trying to save for those different measures in terms of the reduction in potential risk.
So we've been talking a lot about building owners, getting people to understand these things, some of the things you look at, but we haven't actually talked about what is it you are doing with Ripple Resiliency? What exactly are the services that you provide?
Yeah, sure. So typically we would start with that risk assessment and then looking beyond just current risk to what's the future risk and how would that potentially impact the building infrastructure or operations of the building. So do that assessment and then working with the architect and the engineers to incorporate resilience measures into the design of the building. Or for a master plan, be incorporating climate resilience and adaptation measures, not just structural measures, but also thinking through things like how can we incorporate nature-based solutions? So things like rain gardens and bioswales, and how can we have more permeable areas, lighter colored pavements, reducing the impact of heat island effect, recharging the groundwater, as opposed to just sending all of the rainwater to the city systems, which are already overwhelmed. We're really looking at how can we work with nature to maximize the value nature could provide in dealing with natural hazards, basically, and minimizing the impact on the built environment.
Is there a little bit of a self-selection bias where the owners, the project developers who are coming to you are already those who are thinking more about resiliency, right? Especially possibly willing to consider climate change. So those folks who are like, I don't need to think about this at all, they're never even going to talk to you in the first place.
Yes and no. I would say where there's already a flood risk, I often get brought in to look at minimum requirements. And then I often will have a more broad discussion with them about, okay, so these flood risks exist now, and this is how they're projected to change over the next 20, 50 years, over the useful life of the building and the infrastructure that you're designing or own, right? And so how can we minimize the pain associated with that change is really what we're looking to do, is minimizing the disruption and the damage in the future.
What you offer, it's like a holistic view, right? It's not just how do we deal with flood risk? Let's elevate a building. I'm referring to the nature-based solutions that you talked about that can provide not only like flood mitigation, but also heat mitigation and many other benefits to a building. I would recommend Ripple Resilience to a building owner and manager. And also, it appears that you look at not just the design of the building, but also the operation, right? Because you mentioned that you can deal with those hazards not just via design, but also emergency management.
Yeah, that's a very important part of it, actually. And I think people often think, oh, we'll just design X, Y, and Z, and then it'll just magically happen. That training and awareness part with your facility staff is arguably just as important. If you don't have the first part, you can't have the second part. It's not going to be much use, but you really need them to be working in concert to actually minimize the impacts overall. Like if you just don't put up one flood barrier, you could have a significant amount of damage. The system's only as good as it is complete. And that is, I think, kind of a different aspect actually between flood and earthquake. You can have incremental improvements with the seismic resilience. And then with flood, if you miss one piece of the puzzle and you didn't look at it holistically, then everything you did may not provide any assistance, So I think that taking that holistic and integrated view is really, really critical. I would just also give a plug for, we do often work very closely with the sustainability team or design team. I really do think there's a lot of confusion between what sustainability is versus what resilience is. And one is trying to reduce the impacts that we have on the climate, and the other is dealing with, okay, things are changing. How do we reduce the impacts that the climate has on us or our infrastructure, right, and the built environment? But ultimately, they can work very much together. While there are some slightly opposing concepts in there, they're also very complementary. And ideally, we will be both reducing the risk of the impacts from climate change, but also reducing the impact the project has on the environment as well. Yeah, I think the nature-based solutions are one of those really magical pieces to that puzzle that really works for both.
Yeah, that address both.
Yeah,
Jessica and I also spend a lot of time differentiating sustainability, resilience, climate mitigation versus adaptation, synergies, conflicts. I think that piece is really important. But yes, nature-based solutions often addresses both.
Yeah, we see it also more in master planning, where we're working very closely. What does climate action look like on both sides of the coin? And then I think if you add in the circular economy piece and taking a circular approach to design, then you can also tie a lot of those pieces together.
Yeah, that makes sense. You mentioned that getting involved in a project as early as possible is essential. When exactly should you get involved? Is it before RFP, after RFP, after the engineer is retained? When should a client call you?
Yeah, I suppose it depends who the client is, but ideally, as we said, as early as possible. ideally the RFP already speaks to wanting to incorporate climate resilience and adaptation. Sometimes it doesn't. We are starting to see a lot more of the city RFPs that are coming from the larger municipalities around the country are incorporating, or at least having some sort of note about incorporating climate action in some form, whether it's mitigation, adaptation, resilience, or all a combination of those. At that point, yeah, whoever's writing the RFP ideally has someone advising them to incorporate that, and then getting on the team as quickly as possible to be working in concert with the rest of the disciplines, with the other disciplines of the project. Really, that should happen right at the very beginning. And I think, as I kind of mentioned earlier, when that does happen at the very beginning of a project, that's really when we see resilience as what part of the framework of the building or the project. And we really see that it has the biggest impact on reducing the risk at the least cost.
That makes sense. I have seen RFPs where, as you said, there's some mention, right? So it would say something like, this building needs to be flood resilient, but that doesn't tell you much, right? It's flood resilience, like for how long, what areas in the building, etc. So there would have to be a discussion after.
Yeah, and there should be a workshop really with the client that is in that very early stage, being like, these are some of the things to consider and potential impacts, and here are some ideas of different levels or ways that we can incorporate resilience into the project to help get that guidance early on, rather than wait until the project's well into its progression. It's better to get that guidance as part of that, almost as part of the design criteria discussion at the beginning.
Which leads me to a question. I do construction litigation, and I see a lot of litigation with a finished building, for example. Something didn't go right and there's a problem. And it usually falls into one of three categories. Either there's something wrong with the design, something wrong with material specified, or the construction kind of means and methods. And I see that too, as climate change basically can have an impact on all of those. The actual like design for the building, the material specified, especially I think water can be a big issue if you're not specifying the proper materials for, let's say, higher groundwater tables, things like that, or the actual construction process. So when you're consulting, are you focused more on just when you're working with owners, developers who are, let's say, building an office building, are you focusing more on just the design specs, or are you looking at, are we thinking about the materials? Are we thinking about construction related issues? For example, if we have heavier rainfalls during construction, is that going to impact our ability to build this in a safe way? What all do you look at?
Yeah, I would be involved across that full spectrum, actually. And even when you talk about the construction and risks during construction as well, there's also different stages of the construction that's constantly evolving, right? And if you've got a site that's within the floodplain, thinking about at different stages of the construction and where you are in the hurricane season, for example, that is also relevant for thinking about, okay, what sort of protection and what means of protection might we use that are just temporary to protect the site or the adjacent sites. So we have seen time and time again where construction sites have ended up allowing water from the construction site into an adjacent site because it was open at the time during a significant flood event, right? That building might normally, if there wasn't a construction site next to it, there wouldn't have been the water access from one building to the next. And so thinking about things, I think, holistically and a step-by-step kind of approach is really important for the construction process. And often I think it is just bypassed, just given it's a short time period versus we're designing for long time periods, right? That 20, 50, 100 plus years, some of these buildings are obviously still around. So thinking about the construction time period is also important when we're talking about natural hazard risk, an easy one to miss. So
yeah, that's a really good point. Often, I think what you're alluding to is that often the construction site will be more vulnerable than the finished building itself,
yes,
right?
until all the pieces are in place, right? And so providing that, I can also work with construction sites to provide that view on if there is something forecast to happen, let's have these intermediary plans for how can we protect the site and any adjacent buildings during that construction period.
Yeah, that's really an
Yeah.
important point.
Yeah.
You have been at this work for a while now. Have you seen any change in awareness about the need to address climate adaptation?
Yes, I think in a big way, actually. And I
Good.
think that's very positive. I do think that the finance industry has really picked up its knowledge and awareness of the impacts of climate change over the last 5 to 10 years, I would say. I think if you look at the way that these new regulations, like the ones you're talking about in California, are a prime example, they are globally gaining a lot of steam as well. And so I think that physical and the transition risk that in the global financial space is now leading to a change in awareness at the upper levels of companies, and where the C-suite starts speaking about this, it then trickles down to discussions that might have previously been quashed with project managers and developers. When you start to have that, in the air from above as well, you have a much greater opportunity to be able to actually make change rather than and enhance the resilience of a design or a building or a facility than we previously did 10 years ago, let's say.
I love that. That's good news. We need more and more of that, obviously, but I will
We
take
do.
every bit of good news. And quite frankly, insurance, finance, that drives a lot of decisions. So if those two industries, and we talk a lot about how insurance is very aware of the risk of climate change. And so if the financial industry is too, I think that really, better or worse, that will drive a lot of change. And so that's good. So I have to ask you again, based on your experience with disasters and working in resiliency, what do you think is something that everybody, our audience is hopefully everybody who touches the built environment, architects, developers, engineers, material manufacturers, contractors, what is something you would wish that all of those folks working on the built environment would keep in mind when they're thinking about climate change and how it impacts their job, their project, their business?
Yeah, I think it's crucial to consider long-term impacts and adopting a proactive approach to resilience. So this means not just addressing the current risks, which the bare minimum per the building code right now, but also anticipating those future changes and uncertainties related to climate and how they'll change over the useful life or the life of the building or the infrastructure, and really emphasizing flexibility, adaptability, and that ongoing evaluation that needs to happen, because buildings are always changing, the way we use them is always changing, and also those hazards in the climate that we're living in is also changing. So it's not just a one-time fix, we did this assessment and it's done kind of thing. We need to be continually revisiting this question and talking about making sure that both our structures, buildings, and communities remain resilient in the face of these evolving climate challenges. So yeah, that's what I'd say.
Amy, it has been a pleasure to have you in our podcast. We'll make sure we include links to your firm and a couple of the news and resources that you alluded to. Thank you for joining us today, and I hope that we stay in touch.
Yeah,
Thank you so much, Amy.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks for listening to Adapt: Climate Change and the Built Environment. We hope you enjoyed this episode and come back to hear more of our conversations with people leading the way and addressing the issues facing the built environment as our climate changes. Please rate, review, and subscribe, and share our podcast with others who may be interested. And if you have any feedback or suggestions for topics or guests for future seasons, we'd love to hear from you. You can email us at adaptthebuiltenvironment@gmail.com. Thanks for listening.